Lecture 7, Yeats Among School Children, Secular Education and the Reproduction of Poetic Knowledge.
Ladies and gentlemen, William Butler Yeats, the author of Among School Children, which is my text in this lecture, was a modern poet who despised the term modern, born in the 19th century. You must remember, 1865, before modernism as we generally understand it, and who died in 1939 after the high modern moment in literature and on the threshold of the Second World War. In Yeats' lifetime, high modern poetry was invented in some large measure by himself. The modern poets in the West, for example, Pound, Eliot, Williams, Valery, Rilke, were fundamentally concerned not only with the making and dissemination of poems, but with the reproduction of poetic culture and with the reproduction of the social and psychodynamic conditions in which poetic knowledge could be reproduced, as if history intended the erasure of poetry by the erasure of the institutions which reproduced the relationships in which you could have poetry at all. In this matter, the modern tradition in poetry differs substantially as we receive it from the tradition which modernism received. That difference which I wish to address with particular attention today is that difference that is signified by the modern poet's attention to the building of institutions upon which the success of the poetic institution depends. As Eliot engaged in the building of the Church of England, as Pound engaged in the rectification of the theory of money, as Yeats engaged in nation building just so, as the national poet and subsequently the senator of the Irish Free State and then the Republic. By their efforts, the modern poets formed the curriculum in poetry which I received and taught in the university in the 50s. And as among the institutions which they shaped the canon which defines poetic legitimacy, the negative contour of which delineates the curriculum in poetry which my children receive to this day. Modern poetic culture exhibited an historically singular anxiety with respect to its own continuity. And the poets themselves responded as if their task was to devise the social conditions under which the continuity of poetic culture might be secured by analyses. Eliot's idea of a Christian society, for example, or by persuasion, Pound's ABC of reading, or Yeats' a vision, and also by concerns for social structure itself. Eliot's singular devotion to social hierarchy, Yeats' passionate intention of the reconstruction of ideology of the aristocracy, Pound's vicious and maniac attacks upon the bourgeoisie, Williams' effort to reconstruct a basic American discourse by the discovery of a fundamental American class. These projects, as I have said, characterize modernism and differentiate the commission of the poet in modernism from the commission of the poet at other times in history as we confront it. The room in which I am talking to you now is, for this moment, a classroom. And the construction of the classroom, which is a machine for the reproduction of the relationships in which poetry can both be understood and reproduced, is doubled by the long schoolroom of the first line of the poem before us. I walk through the long schoolroom questioning. Poetry has been present in the schoolroom throughout the history of Western civilization. That, for sure, is the long schoolroom. In the Greek schoolroom, as part of the system of instruction, the paideia, which conveyed paradigms or models of civic life, in the Roman schoolroom, where Virgil and Horace in their own lifetimes were taught as texts to school children, in the later Middle Ages, poetry was present as models of discourse of a kind. Samuel Johnson in the 18th century took poetic texts as paradigmatic instances of word usage, in effect as regulative examples invoked in his dictionary to stabilize the language. In the Bible, for example, the Psalms, the whole cosmos becomes a schoolroom, and we address God with the imperative, teach us the language which describes the world in accord with its maker's understanding of the world's proper description. But the function of poetry and the poem in the schoolroom, already in the Greek world subject to criticism in the counter-schoolroom of Socrates, Plato, but particularly after the 18th century, in the time of Keats' poem which we have studied, becomes particularly complex and even paradoxical in the period in which we are now studying. The relationship between the function of the school, which is to reproduce normative socialization, and the function of the poem, which contradicts normative socialization in the interest of poetic knowledge, of which exemplars are the speaker in Emily Dickinson's poem and the speaker subject to self-revision in Dickens, becomes increasingly apparent in Keats's poem, becomes increasingly apparent. There is a sense that there is an aesthetic education which contradicts normative socialization and is nonetheless fundamental to it. But also that poetic knowledge is both necessary to the civil order and endangered by the prestige of rationalities of other kinds, and at the same time endangering because, particularly to liberal models of civility, because of the radical imperatives to structure, such as we have discussed inside poetic knowledge. The poem which we are going to study is a poem in which the poet, not the poem, appears in the schoolroom. The poem which we are going to discuss is a poem in which the poet in the schoolroom, the unacknowledged legislator appearing as the acknowledged legislator, that is to say the senator, enacts the blockage to the assimilation of poetic knowledge in the modern state of affairs in which to which the poem makes reference. Anxiety for the reproduction of poetic knowledge in the modern period includes both consciousness of the fragility of the tradition in times of unprecedented civilizational discontinuity, and consciousness also of the wildly uncontrollable implications, political and psychological, of that relationship to source by which poetic knowledge is constituted and the conditions required for its reproduction are maintained. Many of you will be able to call to mind the extremity of the strategies by which the modernist poet attempted to imagine institutions which would effect the maintenance of the poetic tradition in history. Eliot wrote of cultural purity, and he thought, I think not occasionally, but often, that the proper education and service of poetic knowledge could only be conducted in monasteries. Pound became a vociferous fascist, as you know. Yeats, in his latest years, expressed conviction that the particular kind of human beauty intended by poetic knowledge had best be reproduced by eugenic means, the replacement of natural selection by, in effect, poetic selection of specific persons through the selection of specific parents. In the poem called Among School Children, we find the poet, as I have said, in disguise in the classroom, contemplating that blockage to the reproduction of precisely the kind of value which I am recommending to you by these lectures. We find him in the classroom, the long schoolroom where poetry has always been, walking and questioning, walking and then stopped, as if the presence of poetry in the classroom or its absence was itself subject to urgent interrogation, in response to which the poet, as represented in the poem, is forced back upon his own history in relation to his art, concretely in the poem, by the stare of the children. In fact, William Butler Yeats visited a school in Waterford in the southeast of Ireland called St. Otteran's, a school run on Montessori principles, in February 1926, and recorded shortly thereafter in a notebook the following, and I wish you to try to bear in mind Yeats's note, which I will now read, quote, "Topic for poem, school children, and the thought that life will waste them. Perhaps that no possible life can fulfill our dreams for them, or even their teacher's hope." And then Yeats reminds himself, bring in the old thought, he says to himself, that life prepares for what never happens. Now, it is upon the incapability, or the incompatibility, more correctly, of possible life with hope, even their teacher's hope, that the study of poetry in this decade and this room is situated, because the poem is one long-considered product of human work devised to mediate by regulation between moral purposes, our dreams for the children, and actual possible states of affairs. In 1922, Yeats had become a senator in the Irish Free State. He was present in the classroom, as recorded in the note and the poem, in 1926 as a member of an official committee charged with making recommendations for the reconstruction of education in the newly formed state. The planning of education in a post-revolutionary situation is a particular kind of educational problem. You can see that. After a revolution, the state demands conformity to the principles upon the basis of which the revolution was initiated, right? So the business of such a committee is either, as in Maoist China, to reconstruct education in such a way that it reflects, without deviation, the principles of the revolutionary government, or to protect the children, to block the children from that totalitarian reproduction. And that is the role which Yeats took in the Irish Senate, as a mediator between the demands of the state and the autonomous life of the children. This particular educational problem, the negotiation of competing claims of state ideology and personal freedom, that old thought that life, including revolution, prepares for what never happens, repeats certain contradictions that we have already seen in the poem. The contradiction between the unconscious unitivity with source that Keats repudiates, which would correlate with the alignment of instruction in the school and the ideology of the state on the one hand, and that protection of the self and the children from that ideology, or the ideology of poetry itself, by constructing middle terms such as Shakespeare's reason, which would regulate the bearing of social order and its demands upon the educational practice in the state schools. We find the poet in disguise among school children at a moment of the deferral of the relevance of poetic knowledge to education. He is, as I said before, the unacknowledged legislator in the disguise of an acknowledged legislator, a public man, a senator. The poem figures a man empowered in the social world, driven by the stare of the children. The children's eyes in momentary wonder stare upon a 60-year-old smiling public man, driven by the stare of the children to assess the resources which poetic knowledge supplies toward the regulation of the bearing of the state upon the individual, of action in general. Now, practically speaking, the poem among school children consists of a sequence of 8 numbered stanzas, as does its structural predecessor, which we have studied, namely Keats' Odes to the Nightingale. Each stanza of the 8 numbered stanzas of Among School Children consists of 8 lines of equal length. The poem is therefore symmetricalized at several levels. As the reader traverses the sequence of stanzas, the line of 8 units or stanzas, each made up of 8 lines, 2 kinds of motion or direction, 2 kinds of narrative are indicated. First, at the level of text, there is a linear, or what I'm inclined to call a horizontal narrative, the story that the numbered count of stanzas, the Roman numerals as printed in your text, tell as they conduct us from the beginning to the end of the poem as it was inscribed and printed. This horizontal or linear narrative specifies the stanzas as additive, 1 plus 1 plus 1. Counting is a story. I do not know the bottom of that story of counting. It appears to me, however, to be additive and to be linear. One of the kinds of narrative in this poem are marked and repeated by the story about numbers as they go from 1 to 8, internal to the stanza and between stanzas, for there are both 8 lines to a stanza and 8 stanzas to the poem. Linear time is additive. So this first narrative repeats the characteristic of linear time, which adds 1 moment to the next. In this take upon the stanza sequence, the stanzas are recorded and experienced like moments in linear time, as distinct and sequential, familiar timekeepers and space keepers of conscious life. Now, the second kind of narrative, identical with the printed text, which I have just displayed as a linear narrative, is vertical, not horizontal. For as you will note, the story the poem tells is about a guy who started to walk across the room and then was pitched by the stare of the children into a succession of ever deeper discoveries of the self. I walk, and then I dream, and then I am in ecstasy in the presence of her image. The second kind of narrative is a vertical narrative, when the children's gaze actualizes in the speaker the difference between his outer disguise, aging public man, and inner poetic identity, in some way unaging and other than public in the common social sense. The man is made by the question in the children's eyes, their stare, a poet again, and pitched downward to the source of poetic power by a series of associative traversals from the present of the classroom into ever deeper transpersonal dream. In this second vertical narrative, the structure of the stanza ceases to be additive and becomes transformational. We can either regard the 8 lines, 8 times repeated, as a succession of events, or we can regard them as one event, for the stanzas are arithmetically identical one with the other. We can regard them as one event, that is to say, as functioning like a single box 8 by 10, which is filled, emptied, and then refilled with a new content. And what is experienced as a succession of discrete moments in linear time, through time narrative of the sort called diachronic, the first state of structure in this poem which I'm describing, becomes in the second state a series of transformative conditions of the same moment in the all-at-onceness of time in an archetypal journey. The interrelationship of these 2 states of the metrical stanza, one of which is projects a linear narrative, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the other a transformational one in which the analogy of the box filled and refilled, in which successive states replace rather than conserve one another. The metamorphic model, the vertical model, accomplishes in its relationship between these two principles the regulated relationship between consciousness, the linear narrative, and other or archetypal or preconscious experience, on the basis of which the poem becomes a constructed whole insofar as it does. And I am going to make some claims about the manner in which these two structures are and are not related in intelligible ways, one to the other. The journey into which the stare of the children's eyes in momentary wonder stare, pitches the public man, concludes in the disclosure, stanza 8, of the cosmic archetype of the classroom of stanza 1. Stanza 1 offers us the classroom, right? I walk through the long schoolroom, questioning. The kind old nun in the white hood replies, right? At the end, in stanza 8, we get the archetype of the reproduction of civilization. You get the great sexual chestnutry and the phallic bowl and the dancer. We get, in effect, a primal scene of the reproduction of the universe. Consequently, the poem is constructed to traverse the distance between the long schoolroom in history and its archetypal reproduction as the primal scene by which the universe regenerates itself, which is a rather clearly Dantean representation of the great phallic power and the great female power in continuous actions of the reproduction of the world. The poem concludes by adding to the accident or historical classroom its cosmic archetype. The stanzaic box constructed in stanza 1 is filled and refilled 8 times until at last it comes to contain the originary moment or cosmic first state of that function which reproduces civilization. Remember, classrooms reproduce civilization. They are semiconductors. They are regulated systems by which civilization transmits itself across time. The schoolroom is the site of the reproduction of the knowable world. Its archetype is the tree and the dancer. The business of the teacher, all-star teacher, is to reproduce the archetype in the historical accident of the teacher in present time. The question which Yeats' poem poses is whether there is any relationship between the classroom and history and its primordial condition, whether its function in history can be amplified by a relationship to the archetype of its function in such a way as to make the classroom in history a place which transmits the vitality of the world or represses it, an issue at stake in every classroom that I have ever, for all the decades I have taught, been in. That cosmic archetype is, as I have said, figured stanza 8 as the vast copulative primal scene. Oh, chestnut tree, oh, body swayed to music. And the linear narrative of the text is the track by which it is possible, if it is indeed a track, to make the crossing and therefore connection between the classroom and history and its always regenerative basis deep in the reality that poetic knowledge discloses. But you will note that the word history at the end of line 4 in stanza 1 is the only unrhymed word at line end in the poem. The question as to whether history and the primal scene of instruction have any morally effective relationship that can be reproduced in the actual world, whether there is a possible life that can fulfill our dreams, remains to be answered. Like Keats' ode, Yeats' poem ends with an interrogative sentence, a question. The vertical narrative of the poem divides the horizontal or linear text into two parts. Stanzas 1 through 4, you will note, record the journey from linear time, historical temporality, downward to the synchronic, that means all at once, temporality of archetypal generality. Stanzas 5 through 8 explore the space of archetypal generality, and you can see the division is very marked as I read the poem in a moment. And conclude with the characteristic poetic action of apostrophe. For Yeats' poem is a poem in which apostrophe, or the address to source, comes not at the beginning, but at the end, as if it were the thing that the poem is aimed to construct, and as if the problematic of apostrophe were the problematic upon which the success or failure of the intention of the poem depended. Line 53, O presences. Line 56, O mockers. Line 61, O chestnut tree. Line 63, O body, O glance. These callings to source establish a relationship as of a questioner to an answerer. Although the speaker narrates himself as a questioner in line 1 of the poem, no question is articulated until the last line addressed to the source, just so, 5 times invoked as I have indicated. The journey to the primal scene of instruction, which poetic knowledge intends to supply for the purpose of restoring the moral life of the scene of instruction in history, is bound to history by a sequence of genealogies. How are we going to get from the classroom in history, the schoolroom in history, this room in history, to the vital archetype of the reproduction of the culture which the schoolroom intends? Yeats's poem offers us the model of the genealogy. A genealogy is an account of the links between the body in any given present moment and the source of bodies. As in Bible, genealogies connect historical present with Adam and Eve, and through Adam and Eve with God. Genealogies are a privilege of the elite social class, and genealogies are hoarded by elite social classes.
This is the end of Side A. Please fast forward the cassette and turn it over to continue.